My stepmother threw me out of my father's house in the middle of a rainstorm, dumped everything I owned into the mud, and told me to pick up your garbage. She smiled the entire time, until the richest man in Connecticut stepped out of his car and saw everything. Before I tell you what happened next, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story ends with a woman losing everything she stole. And if you've ever been pushed down by someone who was supposed to love you, you are going to feel every second of what comes next. Now let's go back to that driveway. Rain had turned the gravel into soup. My suitcase hit the ground first. Then my mother's old jewelry box, the one thing I had left of her, cracked open against a rock. "You don't live here anymore, Emily," Diane said, wiping her hands like she'd touched something dirty. "This is my house now." I stood there in the downpour, watching photographs of my father float in a puddle. "Diane, my father hasn't been dead a year." "And your father left me in charge," she snapped. "Not you." Behind her, a black Bentley pulled through the gate. Diane didn't even turn around. She was too busy enjoying herself. "Pick up your garbage and get off my property before I call the police," she said, loud enough for the driver to hear. The car door opened. A tall man in a charcoal coat stepped out, umbrella already up, eyes already on the scene in front of him. Marcus Sterling, CEO of Sterling Capital, the man my father had spent 11 months trying to get a meeting with, because his investment was the only thing that could save Carter Textiles from bankruptcy. Diane finally turned and her whole face changed. "Mr. Sterling," she gasped, smoothing her blouse like that would erase what he'd just watched. "I am so sorry you had to see this. My stepdaughter was just leaving." Marcus didn't smile. He looked down at the mud, at the broken jewelry box, at the photograph of a man he clearly recognized floating face up in a puddle. "Is that Robert Carter?" he asked quietly. Diane's smile cracked. "My husband, Emily's father. He passed away 8 months ago." Marcus crouched down, right there in the rain, and picked up the photograph. He looked at me, soaked, humiliated, kneeling in the mud trying to save what was left of my mother's jewelry. Then he looked at Diane. "And you're throwing his daughter out in a storm?" It wasn't a question. Diane laughed nervously. "It's a family matter, Mr. Sterling. Nothing that concerns your investment." "Everything concerns my investment," he said. "I don't put my money behind people who treat family like trash." I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because it's the moment everything changed, but it is not the reason Diane lost everything. That reason goes back further. 3 years further, actually, to the day my father married her. My dad was a good man. Too good, honestly. He built Carter Textiles from a single sewing machine in a Bridgeport garage into a company with 400 employees. My mother died when I was 16, and for 2 years it was just us, him and me, eating cereal for dinner because neither of us knew how to cook a real meal. Then Diane came along. She was charming at first. Warm laugh, always complimenting his tie, always asking about me at dinner. I actually liked her, in the beginning. Her son Chad moved in around the same time. Quiet kid, always on his phone, always watching everyone a little too closely. The wedding was small. My dad looked happier than I'd seen him in years. I told myself that was enough. It should have been enough. But 6 months into the marriage, the compliments turned into corrections. "Emily, you're 22, you should be paying rent." "Emily, that internship is a waste of your father's connections. You should be working at the company." "Emily, Chad needs the guest room. You can take the smaller one." Small things. Death by 1,000 small things. My father, God rest him, never noticed because Diane was a different person when he was in the room. She saved her real voice for when he wasn't. 2 years into their marriage, my dad had a heart attack at his desk. 58 years old. Gone before the ambulance even arrived. I found out from a phone call at work, standing in a stairwell, sliding down the wall until I was sitting on cold concrete, unable to breathe. Diane cried at the funeral. I'll give her that. The tears looked real. But 3 weeks later, she was already meeting with lawyers about the company's structure, and I was still sleeping with one of his old sweaters because it still smelled like him. Here's where it gets ugly. My father's will left 40% of Carter Textiles to me directly. Diane got 30%, Chad got 10%. The remaining 20% went into a trust, to be released to me on my 25th birthday, managed until then by, guess who, Diane, as executor. On paper, I was set for life. In reality, Diane controlled the trust, controlled the house, and controlled every single decision that touched the business until I turned 25. I had 11 months left. 11 months of Diane finding ways to push me further and further out of my own father's legacy. She started with my office. "We need the space for the new CFO," she said, and moved my desk into a storage closet. Then it was my access. "It is updating security protocols," she said, and my company email stopped working for 2 weeks, conveniently during the exact time major supplier contracts were being renegotiated. Then it was my presence at meetings. "You wouldn't understand the financial details anyway, sweetheart," she said in front of the entire board, smiling the whole time like she was doing me a favor. I remember sitting in that boardroom, cheeks burning, watching grown adults nod along like she'd said something perfectly reasonable. Nobody defended me. Not because they didn't like me, but because Diane had spent 2 years quietly rewriting the story of who I was. The grieving daughter who couldn't handle stress. The girl who needed time to find herself. The stepchild who wasn't really involved in the business, you know. Each phrase sounded harmless on its own. Together, they built a cage. And I watched her build it, brick by brick, smiling the entire time, telling myself I'd remember every single one of those bricks for later. There were nights I sat in my car in the parking garage after work, just breathing, just trying to hold myself together long enough to walk back into that house without crying in front of Chad. Chad, for his part, barely looked at me anymore. He used to be shy and awkward when he first moved in, the kind of kid who apologized for existing. Somewhere along the way, that shyness curdled into something colder, something that watched me with the same calculating patience his mother had. I should have seen it as a warning sign. I kept my mouth shut because my father used to say something to me over and over when I was a kid and other kids were cruel. "Emily, quiet people who watch everything usually win in the end. Loud people just win the room." I held on to that. I watched everything. And that's how, 3 weeks before that rainy afternoon in the driveway, I found the first crack. I was in the storage closet they now called my office, going through old supplier invoices because Diane had asked me to organize the archive, which was really just her way of giving me busy work to keep me distracted. But busy work, with access to 5 years of financial records, is a mistake you make when you assume the person you're humiliating isn't paying attention. I found a vendor called Halcyon Logistics. Never heard of them. Payments to Halcyon Logistics had started 4 months after my father died. Small at first. 6,000 here, 9,000 there. Then bigger. $40,000 in a single month for what the invoice vaguely called supply chain consulting services. I looked up Halcyon Logistics that night on my phone, hiding in the bathroom because it was the only room in the house with a lock. The business registration was filed 8 months earlier. The registered agent was a name I recognized immediately because I'd seen it on Chad's mail 100 times. Chad Whitmore, my stepbrother, Diane's son, a 24-year-old with no consulting experience, no employees, no office, running a company that had already billed Carter Textiles over $300,000 in 5 months. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped my phone into the sink. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was theft. This was my father's company, my father's legacy, being drained dry by people who never built a single thing in their lives. And that's when the second, worst discovery landed on me like a truck, right around the same time, because betrayal in this family never comes alone. I overheard Diane on the phone, late one night, thinking I was asleep. The board vote is in 11 months, right after her birthday. Once the trust releases to her, she gets full voting rights on that 20%. And with her 40, that's 60% control. We lose everything. So we move the majority sale before then. Sterling's people are already interested. We sign before she turns 25, and there's nothing she can do about it. I stood frozen in the hallway. They weren't just stealing small amounts through a fake consulting company. They were planning to sell a controlling stake of my father's entire company to Marcus Sterling's firm, before my trust released, before I had any legal power to stop it, and pocket the money for themselves. My father built that company with his hands, and his wife was about to sell it out from under his own daughter, using his own daughter's inheritance as collateral for lies she'd tell in the boardroom. I didn't cry that night. I was too far past crying. I sat on the bathroom floor and I made a decision. I was done being quiet in the way that let people walk over me. I was going to be quiet in the way my father meant, watching, waiting, building my case. But before I could even begin, Diane made her move faster than I expected. And that brings us back to that driveway, in the rain. Because 2 days after I overheard that phone call, Diane found the folder. I'd hidden copies of the Halcyon invoices in an old binder in my closet, behind winter coats. She was looking for something else, some paperwork for the house insurance, and she found it instead. She didn't confront me with words. She confronted me by having my things packed into garbage bags while I was at the grocery store and dumped in the driveway. Timed, I'm almost certain now, exactly for when Marcus Sterling's car was scheduled to arrive for their private signing meeting. She wanted me gone before he saw me. She wanted me humiliated enough to disappear quietly. Instead, she humiliated herself in front of the one man who could destroy her plan with a single phone call. Let's go back to that moment in the rain, because there's more to it than I told you. Marcus stood up, photograph still in his hand, rain soaking through his coat, and he looked at me with something I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. Respect. "Ms. Carter," he said, "you're Robert's daughter." "Yes, sir." "I read his obituary. Impressive man, built something real." He glanced at Diane. "I was under the impression the family was united behind this partnership." Diane's laugh came out too high, too fast. "We are, completely. This is just a small misunderstanding." "It didn't look small," Marcus said. He turned back to me. "Ms. Carter, do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" I nodded, throat too tight to speak, because my best friend Sophia lived 20 minutes away, and I already knew she'd take me in without a single question. "Good," he said. "Get somewhere dry. We'll talk soon." Then, and I will never forget this part, he looked directly at Diane. "Mrs. Carter, I don't sign deals with people who treat family this way. I'll have my office reach out about rescheduling. Or not scheduling at all. We'll see." He walked back to his car without another word. Diane stood in the rain, mascara running, watching a $300 million deal walk away from her because of her own arrogance. And for the first time in almost a year, I felt something other than grief. I felt hope. But hope doesn't win a legal battle, and I knew it. That night, soaked to the bone, sitting on Sophia's couch wrapped in a towel, I laid everything out on her coffee table. The Halcyon invoices, screenshots of the registration filing, notes from the phone call I'd overheard. Sophia looked at it all and said one thing. "You need Alan Reyes." Alan Reyes had been my father's personal attorney for almost 20 years before Diane ever pushed him out in favor of her own lawyer. I hadn't spoken to him since the funeral, mostly because Diane made it clear that contacting outside counsel wasn't welcome. I called him the next morning. He remembered me instantly. "Emily, God, it's good to hear your voice. How are you holding up?" "Not great, Mr. Reyes. I think Diane's been stealing from the company. And I think she's trying to sell it out from under me before my trust releases." There was a long pause on the line. "Come to my office. Bring everything you have. Don't tell anyone you're coming." That was the first move on the chessboard, and I want to tell you, sitting across from Alan Reyes in his office that afternoon felt like the first time in 8 months that someone was actually on my side. Sophia let me stay in her spare room for as long as I needed, and she never once made me feel like a burden, even though I know now I probably cried myself to sleep on her couch more nights than she'll ever admit to noticing. She used to leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror. "You are Robert Carter's daughter. Act like it." Small things, but they kept me upright on the days I wanted to just stop fighting and let Diane have whatever she wanted. I thought about it honestly. There were mornings I genuinely considered signing whatever paper she put in front of me, just to make the exhaustion stop, just to stop feeling like a stranger in my own father's story. But then I'd think about him, standing in that garage with one sewing machine and a dream nobody believed in, and I'd think about how disgusted he'd be watching his wife dismantle everything he built to buy his own stepson a Porsche. That thought got me out of bed more mornings than I can count. He went through every invoice with a red pen, cross-referencing dates, comparing them against the trust documents my father had filed. "This is embezzlement," he said finally, tapping the Halcyon file. "A shell company with no real operations, funneling company funds to a family member. If we can prove Chad Whitmore performed no actual consulting work, this alone could remove Diane as executor of the trust. And the sale to Sterling Capital? That's where it gets interesting, Alan said, leaning back. Your father's will has a clause most people overlook because it's dense legal language buried on page 11. Any sale of majority shares requires unanimous written consent of all shareholders holding voting rights, including trust beneficiaries once notified of the transaction, regardless of whether the trust has technically released. Meaning Diane can't legally sell a controlling stake without your written consent, trust released or not, as long as you're a named beneficiary who's been formally notified. She was hoping you wouldn't know that clause existed. She was hoping you'd be gone before anyone told you. For the first time since my father died, I actually smiled. So what do we do? Alan set down his pen. We do nothing for now. We gather everything, quietly. Bank records, the consulting agreement, if one even exists, time-stamped emails. We build a case so complete that when we present it, there's no room for her to spin a story. And then we choose the moment. Over the next 6 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I worked a temporary job at a small marketing firm Sophia's cousin ran, just to pay rent and stay off Diane's radar completely. By night, I worked with Alan and a forensic accountant named Priya Nandi, who specialized in exactly this kind of corporate fraud. Priya pulled banking subpoenas through the trust's own oversight provisions, which Diane, in her arrogance, never expected anyone to actually use. What we found was worse than I imagined. Halcyon Logistics hadn't billed $300,000. It had billed $940,000 over 14 months, all funneled directly into Chad's personal accounts, most of it already spent on a downtown condo, a Porsche, and, I kid you not, a watch collection worth more than my father's entire first year of business revenue. Priya also found something else, something that made my blood run cold. Diane had been quietly negotiating with Sterling Capital's competitors too, shopping the company around to 3 different buyers, trying to trigger a bidding war before my trust released, clearly planning to walk away with a payout in the tens of millions while I inherited nothing but a hollowed-out shell of my father's company. That was the true scale of the betrayal, and it made the mud puddle in that driveway feel almost quaint by comparison. I remember sitting in Priya's office staring at spreadsheets full of numbers that represented my father's entire working life, watching them get siphoned off screen by screen, transaction by transaction, and feeling a kind of anger I didn't know I was capable of. It wasn't hot anger. It was cold, and it was patient, and it settled into my chest like something permanent. Priya noticed the look on my face and slid a box of tissues across the table. I didn't need them. I'm not going to cry, I told her. I'm going to make sure every single dollar gets accounted for in court, on the record, where she can't talk her way out of it. Priya smiled for the first time since we'd started working together. That's exactly the energy we need for this, she said. But I didn't break. I didn't confront her. I didn't scream, or cry in front of her, or give her a single reason to suspect anything. I stayed quiet, the way my father taught me, and I let her keep digging her own grave. Then, 3 weeks before my 25th birthday, Marcus Sterling's office called Alan Reyes directly, not Diane. Turns out, after that rainy afternoon, Marcus had quietly done his own due diligence on Carter Textiles before making any final decision, and his team's numbers weren't adding up either. Alan and Marcus's legal team started comparing notes, and everything clicked into place. Marcus wasn't just interested in an investment anymore. He wanted the truth. Alan called me on a Tuesday evening. Emily, Sterling wants a meeting, all parties. He's proposing it happen at the company's annual shareholder dinner, in front of the full board, in 10 days. He says, and I'm quoting him, "If there's fraud in this company, I want it exposed where everyone can see it, not swept under a rug in a private room." I sat with that for a long moment. 10 days. The same week as my birthday. The same week the trust would legally release my 20%. It felt like the universe had finally decided to stop laughing at me and start laughing with me. "Let's do it," I said. That night, after I hung up the phone, I sat alone in Sophia's spare room for a long time, just staring at the ceiling. I thought about how strange it was that the woman who once made me feel small enough to disappear was about to be undone by the very people she tried to impress. I thought about my father and how much he hated conflict, how he always tried to see the good in people even when the evidence said otherwise. Part of me wondered if he would have wanted this. The public exposure, the humiliation, the courtroom drama that was about to follow. But then I remembered the invoices. I remembered the phone call. I remembered a photograph of his face floating in a mud puddle while his wife smiled for a billionaire. No, he would have wanted the truth, wherever it landed. He always did. The plan came together with surgical precision. Priya prepared a full forensic report, time-stamped, notarized, undeniable. Alan prepared the legal filing to remove Diane as trust executor on grounds of breach of fiduciary duty, ready to submit the moment the dinner ended, or sooner if needed. And I prepared myself mentally for the hardest performance of my life, sitting across from the woman who threw my mother's jewelry box into the mud, and smiling at her for 10 straight days like I knew nothing at all. Diane, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. She was busy planning her outfit for the dinner, busy telling anyone who'd listen that the Sterling deal is basically done, busy treating Chad's stolen fortune like old news nobody would ever question. The 10 days leading up to that dinner were the longest of my life. I went to work every day at the marketing firm like nothing had changed, smiled at coworkers, answered emails, pretended my entire world wasn't about to detonate in a hotel ballroom. At night, I met with Alan and Priya in a small conference room they'd rented under a fake company name, just in case anyone from Diane's side got suspicious and started asking questions around town. We rehearsed everything. Who would speak first? What documents would be presented and in what order? So the story built like a wave instead of a flood that would just overwhelm the board before they understood what they were looking at. Priya insisted on triple-checking every figure because she said if even one number was wrong, Diane's lawyers would use it to discredit the entire report. "You get one shot at this," she told me. "Make it airtight." I barely slept those last few nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the driveway, the rain, the mud, my mother's jewelry box cracked open on the gravel. I used that image like fuel. The night of the dinner arrived, and the ballroom at the Ridgewood Hotel was full. Board members, investors, Marcus Sterling and his entire executive team, even a few reporters from the local business journal. Because a deal this size doesn't stay quiet in a city like ours. Diane wore emerald green. She looked confident. She looked like a woman who thought she'd already won. I wore my mother's earrings, the ones that survived the mud, cleaned and polished, because some things deserve to come full circle. Dinner went smoothly. Small talk, wine, the usual performance of corporate civility. Then Marcus Sterling stood up, tapped his glass, and the room went quiet. "Before we move to the formal proposal," he said, "I want to address something that's been on my mind since the day I first visited the Carter family estate." Diane's smile flickered just slightly. 2 months ago, I watched a grown woman throw her own stepdaughter's belongings into the mud, in the rain, on the same day I arrived to discuss investing $300 million into her family's company. I found that troubling. So I asked my team to look a little closer at the numbers before we moved forward. The room shifted, murmurs rippling through the tables. Diane's hand tightened around her wine glass. "What we found," Marcus continued, "is that Carter Textiles has been the victim of sustained financial fraud, totaling nearly $1 million, funneled through a shell company registered to Chad Whitmore, with no verifiable services rendered." Gasps. Actual audible gasps, the kind you only hear in movies, except this was real, and it was happening right in front of me. Diane shot to her feet. "This is absurd. Chad's consulting work was completely legitimate." "Was it?" Alan Reyes said, standing from his seat at the far end of the table, folder in hand. "Because Halcyon Logistics has no employees, no office lease, no business insurance, and no client contracts other than the ones your husband's company was pressured to sign after Robert Carter's death. I have bank records. I have the forensic accounting report. I have the emails where you personally instructed the finance department to expedite these payments without board approval." Diane's face had gone completely white. Chad, sitting 2 seats down, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "And there's more," I said, finally standing, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Diane has been quietly shopping a controlling stake of this company to 3 separate buyers over the past 4 months, attempting to force a sale before my trust legally released, in direct violation of my father's will, which requires unanimous shareholder consent for any transaction of this size." "That's not—" Diane started. "It's in writing," Alan said calmly. sliding a folder across the table toward the board chairman. Emails, term sheets, everything. Mrs. Carter has been actively working against the interests of this company's rightful shareholders for months. Marcus looked at Diane, and his voice, when he spoke again, was ice cold. Mrs. Carter, I don't invest in companies run by people who commit fraud against their own family. This deal is off the table, effective immediately. One of the board members, an older man named Harold who'd worked with my father since the very beginning, stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor in the silence. Diane, he said quietly, Robert brought you into this family. He trusted you with his daughter, with his company, with everything he built. And this is what you did with that trust. Diane opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time since I'd known her, she had absolutely no comeback ready. No smooth deflection, no charming smile to paper over the moment, nothing. Just silence, and the weight of an entire room realizing exactly who she really was. The room erupted into whispered chaos. Diane stood there, emerald dress, perfect makeup, absolutely nothing left to say, because for once in her life, the truth had arrived faster than her excuses could. Chad tried to leave the table. Security, quietly arranged by Alan ahead of time given the scale of the fraud, politely asked him to remain seated until the board's legal counsel could speak with him. I watched Diane's face crumble in real time, watched 8 months of careful, cruel control collapse into a single, humiliating public moment, and I felt something I didn't expect. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter than that. Relief. The board voted that same week unanimously to remove Diane as trust executor and to freeze all Halcyon logistics-related accounts pending a full criminal referral to the district attorney's office. The following weeks brought a strange kind of quiet to my life, the kind that comes after a storm finally passes and you're left standing in the wreckage trying to figure out what's still yours. I went back to the house once, just once, to collect a few of my father's things before it went to the estate sale. And I stood in his old study for a long time, running my hand along the edge of his desk, remembering all the nights he'd sit there working late while I did homework on the couch nearby. Diane wasn't there. She'd already been moved to a temporary residence while the criminal case proceeded, her lawyer advising her to stay far away from any property connected to the ongoing investigation. Chad's Porsche had been seized as part of the asset forfeiture, along with most of the watch collection, though I heard through the grapevine that a few pieces mysteriously vanished before investigators arrived, which didn't surprise me in the slightest. Diane and Chad were both charged with embezzlement and fraud within a month. Chad, facing evidence that left him no room to argue, took a plea deal, restitution and probation, since it was his first offense, and Priya's forensic report left absolutely nothing to dispute. Diane fought it, hired the most expensive defense attorney in the state, and lost anyway, because you cannot outlawyer a paper trail that thorough. She was convicted of embezzlement and fraud, sentenced to restitution covering the full amount stolen plus damages, and, because the judge apparently had strong feelings about people who defraud grieving family members, 3 years in state prison. The house went into the settlement, sold, proceeds split according to the original will, my father's will, the one Diane always assumed she could quietly work around. The days after the dinner were a blur of lawyers, board meetings, and reporters calling for comment, and I learned very quickly that public exposure comes with its own kind of exhaustion. But it was the good kind. The kind where every phone call was one more brick removed from the cage Diane had spent years building around me. Harold, the board member who'd worked with my father from the beginning, became something of an unofficial mentor to me during those weeks, walking me through board procedure, teaching me how to read a balance sheet the way my father would have patiently, over coffee, no condescension in his voice at all. Your father would be proud of how you handled this, he told me once, after a particularly grueling shareholder call. Most people would have gone straight to screaming. You went straight to evidence. I thanked him, and I meant it, because for the first time in almost a year, I felt like I actually belonged in that boardroom, not because someone allowed me to be there, but because I'd earned it. Carter Textiles is mine now. Fully, legally, completely mine. With 60% controlling ownership and a board that trusts me because I proved in the hardest way possible that I'd protect this company the way my father would have wanted. Marcus Sterling did eventually invest, 3 months later, once the company was clean and the leadership was, in his words, finally trustworthy. We've built a real partnership since then. Professional, respectful, occasionally over coffee when he stops by to check on quarterly numbers, though I'll let you draw your own conclusions about where that might be heading. I kept my mother's jewelry box. I had it repaired by a woodworker in town, the cracks sanded down, the hinges replaced, and I keep it on my desk now, right next to a framed photo of my father, the same photo that once floated face up in a mud puddle in our driveway. Some people will tell you that revenge isn't worth the energy, that you should just walk away and let karma handle it. I used to believe that too. But I've learned there's a difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is loud, it's messy, it burns you along with everyone else. Justice is quiet. Justice is patient. Justice is gathering every piece of evidence while someone humiliates you in the rain, and waiting for the exact right moment to let the truth speak louder than they ever could. I visit my father's grave sometimes, on Sunday mornings before the office opens, and I sit there and tell him how the quarterly numbers are looking, like he can still weigh in on the big decisions. I like to think he'd approve of the new supplier contracts we signed last spring. I like to think he'd have liked Marcus once he got past the whole billionaire thing, because underneath the expensive suits, Marcus is exactly the kind of stubborn, principled person my father always respected. And I like to think that somewhere, wherever he is, my father saw that moment in the rain, watched his wife throw his daughter's belongings into the mud in front of the one person who could have saved everything she was trying to steal, and understood immediately that karma was already writing its own ending. Sophia still keeps that sticky note on her mirror, the one that used to remind me who I was on the mornings I forgot. I have my own copy now, taped inside my father's old desk drawer, right next to the little wooden box that survived the storm. My father used to tell me that quiet people who watch everything usually win in the end. He was right. And somewhere, I hope he knows his company, his legacy, his daughter, all made it through the storm standing taller than before. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to fight quietly for what was rightfully yours, tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one still to come.